Every country on Earth is in debt. Every nation on Earth is drowning in debt. Even the mighty United States owes $38 trillion. Japan, a global economic titan, owes $9 trillion. And the entire planet? It's buried under $315 trillion and counting. That is 3 times larger than everything the global economy produces in a year. But here's the paradox that should terrify you. If everyone owes money, who exactly is owed? The answer isn't what you think, because when you follow the chain of creditors, when you track who actually holds the debt, you discover something that should chill you to the bone. The world doesn't owe money to anyone in particular. It owes money to itself. And when a government needs money, it issues bonds. Banks and financial institutions buy these bonds. But here's the key part. When banks buy government bonds, they create new money to do it. The debt itself creates the money supply. This means if governments tried to pay off the debt, they would have to pull money out of the economy. But since the debt created that money, paying it off destroys the money supply, which collapses the economy. So governments can't pay off the debt. They can only make interest payments and borrow more. 4 men across 3 centuries designed it that way, deliberately. They built a system where governments borrow, which creates money, which enters the economy, which requires more borrowing to sustain, which creates more money, which requires more borrowing. The cycle cannot stop without collapsing the money supply itself. This isn't a flaw in the system. This is the system working exactly as designed. Let me show you the 4 architects, the 4 moments when each piece of the trap was set, and why every government on Earth is now caught inside it with no way out. Before 1694, kings borrowed money the simple way. They went to wealthy merchants, promised repayment with interest, and if they couldn't pay, they defaulted. Creditors lost their money, the king borrowed from someone else, and the system reset because debt was temporary. William Patterson changed everything. Patterson was a Scottish merchant who spent years in the West Indies and Europe developing business contacts. By 1691, he saw an opportunity in England's desperate financial situation. King William III was fighting France in the 9 Years' War. The treasury was empty, and traditional lenders were refusing new loans because England had defaulted before under Charles II. Patterson approached the king with a proposal that seemed straightforward but contained a revolutionary mechanism. He would organize wealthy merchants to lend the government £1.2 million, roughly $300 million in modern purchasing power. But the loan would never be repaid. Instead, the government would pay interest forever at 8% annually, and Patterson would create a new institution called the Bank of England to manage this arrangement. Here's how the mechanics worked. Merchant lenders gave their gold to the Bank of England, the bank lent it to the government paid interest annually from tax revenue, and the bank distributed that interest to the merchant lenders. But the government wouldn't repay the principal. Not in 1 year, not in 10 years, never. The loan was permanent by design. Why would merchants accept this? Because the interest payment was guaranteed by Parliament, backed by the government's power to tax its citizens. As long as England could collect taxes, the interest would flow every year without stopping. The banknotes the lenders received in exchange for their gold could be traded on the market. And they were as good as money, better than money in some ways, because they paid interest while sitting in your pocket. Parliament approved Patterson's scheme on July 27, 1694, and the target of £1.2 million was raised in just 11 days. For the first time in history, national debt became permanent, not a problem to solve, but a feature of how the system operates. The government paid 8% interest annually on £1.2 million, which works out to £96,000 per year forever. The merchants had bought an annuity from the government that would pay them year after year after year as long as England existed and could tax its people. If they wanted their gold back at some point, they could sell the banknotes to someone else. The debt was transferable from one investor to another, but never repayable by the government. But Patterson's real genius was what came next. The Bank of England was given the right to issue banknotes backed by the government's debt, which meant they could print paper money up to the value of the loan. This created money out of the government's promise to pay. The government's debt became currency that people could spend, and the more the government borrowed, the more money could be created through this mechanism. This is the template that spread across the world. The government borrows, never repays principal, pays interest forever from tax revenue, and the debt itself becomes money circulating in the economy. Within 50 years, every major European power copied the model. France created the Banque Générale, the Netherlands formalized government debt issuance, and by 1790, the newly independent United States adopted the same structure. Alexander Hamilton explicitly modeled America's financial system on the Bank of England, with permanent debt, interest paid from taxes, and bonds traded as currency. Patterson died in 1719, but the system he built persists 331 years later. The Bank of England still exists today. British government debt has never been paid off, never eliminated. The debt trap was set in 1694, and every government since has walked into it willingly. It solved their immediate funding crisis while creating permanent interest payments that flow to bondholders forever. By the early 1800s, European governments had embraced debt as normal. They borrowed for wars, for infrastructure projects, for operating expenses when tax revenues fell short. But there was no organized market for this debt. Each loan was negotiated individually between a government and wealthy merchants. Interest rates varied wildly depending on who had cash available, and only the wealthiest individuals could participate. Nathan Rothschild changed that by industrializing sovereign debt. The Rothschild family started as money changers in Frankfurt's Jewish quarter. By 1800, the 5 Rothschild brothers had established banking houses in 5 major European cities: Nathan in London, James in Paris, Amschel in Frankfurt, Salomon in Vienna, and Karl in Naples. This network was unprecedented because they could move money across borders faster than anyone else through their private courier system using fast horses, dedicated ships, and carrier pigeons. Nathan Rothschild in London was the strategic genius of the operation. During the Napoleonic Wars, Nathan arranged loans for Britain, but his innovation was how he structured them. Instead of lending directly to the government like the old model, he bought government bonds at a discount and then resold them to investors at a markup, creating what we now call a secondary market. Here's how it worked. The government needed money immediately. Rothschild provided it in one lump sum. Then he sold the bonds gradually to pension funds, insurance companies, and wealthy individuals across Europe. The government got its money fast. Rothschild collected the spread between what he paid and what he sold for, and investors got a tradable asset they could sell to someone else if they needed their money back. The Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815, shows how Rothschild used information to dominate the market. Nathan had been supplying Wellington's army with gold and silver coins to pay troops. Between 1814 and 1815, Nathan's transactions with the British government totaled just under £9.8 million. Nathan's courier network brought him news of Napoleon's defeat. Late Monday night, June 19th, or early Wednesday, June 20th, about 24 to 48 hours before the official government dispatch arrived in London. But Nathan's real fortune didn't come from one day of insider trading, as the legend claims. Starting on July 20th, 1815, Nathan made a massive bet on British bonds when prices were still depressed from years of war. British national debt had increased by a factor of 3 between 1793 and 1815, reaching £745 million. The price of a typical £100 bond had fallen from £96 to below £60. Nathan kept buying despite his brother's desperate entreaties to sell. He held his nerve for over 2 years, and in late 1817, when bond prices had risen more than 40%, he finally sold. His profits were worth around £600 million in today's money. But here's where Rothschild made default impossible. Not through one trade, but through making sovereign debt interconnected across borders. Before Rothschild, governments could theoretically refuse to pay, and creditors in one country would lose money while the system reset. But Rothschild made sovereign debt tradable internationally through his 5-city network. A British bond might be owned by a French investor who sold it to a German bank, who used it as collateral for a loan to an Austrian aristocrat. The web of ownership became so complex that defaulting wasn't just refusing one creditor anymore, it was collapsing an entire international financial network. Pension funds would fail, insurance companies would collapse, banks would be insolvent, all from one government refusing to pay. This is the Rothschild innovation that trapped governments. Make debt so interconnected across borders that default becomes impossible, not because governments are responsible, but because default would trigger collapse affecting multiple countries at once. Governments became trapped in a web where they had to keep paying interest, and they had to keep borrowing new money to pay the interest on old debts, because stopping would destroy the entire financial system. The debt trap was no longer just permanent as Patterson designed it. Now it was inescapable because of Rothschild's international network. In 1818, Nathan arranged a £5 million loan to the Prussian government. By 1822, all 5 Rothschild brothers were granted the title of Baron by the Austrian emperor. The Rothschild family wealth peaked in the mid-1800s when they were the richest family in the world, richer than any king or emperor, and that wealth came from one source: interest on sovereign debt. They didn't produce anything, didn't build anything, didn't create any goods. They lent money to governments and collected interest forever while making it impossible for those governments to default without destroying the financial system they'd helped create. The system Patterson created in 1694, Rothschild industrialized and globalized by 1815, and every government in Europe was caught. By 1900, America was becoming an economic powerhouse, but it still had a primitive financial system compared to Europe. Banks operated independently without coordination, the money supply was tied to gold and couldn't expand flexibly, and there was no central mechanism to manage debt or respond to financial panics. Between 1865 and 1913, the United States suffered at least 5 major financial crises. J.P. Morgan fixed that problem, not for the public good, but to protect his banking empire. In October 1907, several banking firms collapsed when depositors withdrew funds, starting with the Knickerbocker Trust Company of New York. On October 22nd, Knickerbocker faced a classic bank run. From the bank's opening, the crowd grew, and as the New York Times reported, as fast as a depositor went out of the place, 10 people and more came asking for their money. The failure of Knickerbocker, which was the third largest trust company in the city, was damaging to public confidence. Within days, runs spread to other trust companies. Stock prices crashed, falling almost 50% from their peak the previous year. The economy shrank, with real gross national product falling 11%. J.P. Morgan personally organized the rescue. He was 70 years old, the most powerful banker in America, and people looked to him as the lender of last resort. His library at Madison Avenue and 36th Street became a revolving door of New York bank and trust company presidents arriving to share information and seek help. Throughout late October, Morgan organized a series of meetings in his library, sometimes literally locking groups of bankers in the room until they agreed to provide funding. He raised money to save various financial companies in New York, convincing Treasury Secretary George Cortelyou and New York financial leaders to provide millions in liquidity within hours after each new emergency. The panic ended by November, but Morgan had essentially acted as a one-man central bank. People wondered, what about the next panic? Morgan was 70 years old and knew he couldn't do it again. So Morgan and his associates designed a permanent solution. They needed a central bank, but Americans hated central banks because the first and second banks of the United States had been shut down by populist opposition in 1811 and 1836. So Morgan's group disguised their plan. In November 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich convened a secret meeting at the Jekyll Island Club off the coast of Georgia. The club was so prestigious that its members were said to represent 1/6 of the world's wealth at the time. For 9 days, they worked around the clock designing the structure of what would become the Federal Reserve System. The meetings were secret because they knew if the public discovered that bankers were designing the nation's monetary system, there would be public outrage. The plan was brilliant political manipulation. The Federal Reserve wouldn't be called a central bank. It would be called a Federal Reserve System to make it sound decentralized and democratic. It wouldn't be one institution. It would be 12 regional banks spread across the country. It wouldn't be controlled by Wall Street bankers. It would be overseen by a board of governors appointed by the president. It looked decentralized, democratic, and public. But the structure ensured banker control at the key pressure points. The regional Federal Reserve banks were privately owned by member commercial banks. Those member banks elected the boards of the regional feds, and the most important power, the power to create money and to buy government bonds, was given to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which was controlled by the largest Wall Street banks. The Federal Reserve Act passed Congress on December 23, 1913, largely because most representatives didn't understand what they were voting for, and because the vote happened during Christmas week when many members were absent. President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law, and immediately the debt trap expanded beyond anything Patterson or Rothschild could have imagined. Now, the government didn't just borrow from banks who had limited gold reserves. It borrowed from the Federal Reserve, which could create money out of nothing to buy bonds. Unlimited demand for government debt. Here's why this matters and why this is the mechanism that enables infinite debt today. Before the Federal Reserve, there was a natural limit to how much the government could borrow because banks only had so much money to lend. If the government wanted to borrow more, it had to offer higher interest rates to attract scarce capital away from other uses. But the Federal Reserve could create money by purchasing government bonds. The government issues a bond. The Fed buys it with newly created money by crediting the seller's account. The government spends the money into the economy. And the debt goes on the Fed's balance sheet, backed by nothing but the promise that taxpayers will service it forever. This is the mechanism that enables infinite debt accumulation. The Federal Reserve ensures there's always a buyer for government bonds, always a demand, regardless of how much the government wants to borrow. The government never has to stop borrowing. It can roll over debt forever, refinancing old bonds with new bonds, because the Fed will always buy whatever quantity is necessary to prevent default. The interest payments flow from taxpayers to the banks that own the Federal Reserve System through their ownership of the regional Federal Reserve banks. Morgan died on March 31st, 1913, 9 months before the Federal Reserve officially replaced his money trust as lender of last resort, but his legacy is the structure that makes the current $38 trillion in U.S. debt possible. Without the Federal Reserve, the government couldn't borrow at this scale because the market wouldn't support it. But with the Fed as a guaranteed buyer creating money to purchase bonds, there's no limit to debt accumulation. The debt trap became infinite in 1913. By the 1970s, the debt trap that Patterson, Rothschild, and Morgan built was functioning globally. Every developed nation borrowed money, rolled over debt when it came due, and paid interest year after year. But developing nations were different because many borrowed for infrastructure projects and then struggled to keep up with payments. The debt trap was reaching its limits in the developing world until Paul Volcker made it permanent and inescapable. Volcker was Federal Reserve Chairman from 1979 to 1987. When he took office, he faced a crisis. Inflation was over 10%, reaching close to 20% at certain points. He needed to stop inflation, even if it meant causing a severe recession. So in August 1979, Volcker announced he would start limiting the growth of the nation's money supply. As money became scarce, banks raised interest rates. The federal funds rate went from 9.5% in August 1979 to more than 16% in May 1981, the highest in American history. He held rates above 12% until July 1982. This crushed inflation, but it triggered worldwide recession. The high cost of borrowing put tens of thousands of firms out of business and led to 22 months of negative growth. In December 1982, unemployment reached 10.8%. The nation's industrial belt was hardest hit, with 90% of job losses occurring in mining, construction, and manufacturing. But Volcker's rate shock had another effect that reshaped global finance. Developing nations had borrowed billions of dollars during the 1970s when interest rates were low. Latin American countries in particular had taken dollar loans at floating rates tied to LIBOR, the London Interbank Offered Rate, which moved with U.S. interest rates. Between 1970 and 1978, Latin American debt skyrocketed from $29 billion to $159 billion. By 1982, the debt level reached $327 billion. Most of this debt was short-term, had to be refinanced frequently, and carried floating interest rates. When Volcker raised rates, the cost of servicing this debt exploded. LIBOR rates averaged 10.2% through 1980, then jumped to 15.8% average for 1981 and 1982. For every percentage point increase in LIBOR, debt service costs for all developing nations rose by $2 billion. Interest payments almost tripled between 1979 and 1982, rising from $15.8 billion to $41.1 billion. Mexico owed $80 billion, Brazil owed over $60 billion, Argentina owed $40 billion. The interest alone exceeded their export revenues because the Volcker rate shock also triggered a global recession that reduced demand for their commodity exports, which were their primary source of foreign currency to make debt payments. In mid-August 1982, Mexico ran out of foreign exchange. Mexican Finance Minister Jesus Silva Herzog informed Federal Reserve Chairman Volcker that Mexico would not be able to continue debt service as scheduled. Mexico was about to default. This should have triggered global financial collapse because American banks had lent most of that money. The 9 largest U.S. banks held Latin American debt amounting to 176% of their capital. If Mexico defaulted, Citibank, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, and others would take massive losses. Some might fail completely. The entire banking system was at risk. Volcker could have let it happen. He could have let the banks take losses, let some fail, let the market clear the bad debts. But he didn't. This is where he made the debt trap inescapable. Here's how it worked. Instead of letting Mexico default, Volcker orchestrated a bailout through the International Monetary Fund. U.S. officials cobbled together enough financing to enable Mexico to continue making interest and principal payments to its banks for a few days. Then, Volcker reached out to other central bankers to implement a bridge loan to provide Mexico with additional immediate financing that would be repaid out of an IMF program. In November 1982, the IMF announced that the financing package would include not only the bank's agreement to reschedule Mexico's principal payments, but also their participation in a new $5 billion loan to Mexico. Here's the key part. Volcker stated that these credits should not be subject to supervisory criticism. This meant U.S. banks could participate in new loans to countries that were effectively broke without having to set aside reserves against those exposures. Before the IMF program for Mexico was complete, Argentina followed Mexico into crisis and received a similar bridge loan. Volcker and the IMF decided to formalize this approach. The plan would apply not only to Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, but also to the Philippines and Yugoslavia. The IMF would lend Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and others enough money to keep making interest payments to American and European banks. The loans came with brutal conditions. The conditions forced governments to cut public spending dramatically, privatize state assets and sell them often to foreign investors, open markets to foreign investment, eliminate subsidies that helped citizens afford food and fuel, and basically dismantle their economic sovereignty in exchange for the money to keep paying interest to foreign banks. And here's the mechanism that made this permanent. The IMF loans didn't reduce debt, they just rolled it over, restructured it, made it manageable in the short term but permanent in the long term. Countries could make interest payments, but never pay down the principal. This is the Volcker innovation that completed the debt trap. When debt becomes unpayable, don't forgive it. Don't let countries default and reset their balance sheets. Instead, restructure it, lend just enough new money to keep interest payments flowing to creditors, and extract political and economic concessions in exchange. The debt trap became a tool of control where countries that couldn't pay were forced to open their economies, sell their state-owned assets often to foreign corporations, and submit to foreign economic policy in exchange for the privilege of staying in debt forever. And this pattern has repeated for over 40 years. By October 1983, 27 countries owing $239 billion had rescheduled their debts to banks, or were in the process of doing so. Greece in 2010, Argentina multiple times, including 2001, Sri Lanka in 2022. Every time the same structure plays out. IMF loans to keep paying interest, public spending slashed, sovereignty surrendered as outside institutions dictate domestic policy, and the debt never eliminated, just restructured and made perpetual. The 1980s became known as the lost decade for Latin America because growth collapsed, living standards fell dramatically, and governments were forced to cut health, education, and infrastructure spending to make debt payments. But the system didn't collapse. It just shifted the burden from creditors to citizens. The debt persisted, the interest kept flowing to banks, and the developing countries were locked into dependency. Volcker died in December 2019, but his legacy is the mechanism that ensures the debt trap is global and inescapable. Even when countries can't pay, they're not allowed to default and start fresh. They're refinanced into permanent indebtedness, where the interest keeps flowing to creditors indefinitely. The same banks, the same institutions, the same system that Patterson created in 1694. Now let me show you why the paradox I opened with isn't just a curiosity, but the fundamental design of the system. The world owes money to itself because debt and money are the same thing in the system. Start with Patterson's model from 1694. Government borrows and pays interest forever, but never repays principal. Add Rothschild's innovation from 1815. Make the debt tradable globally, so it's not one creditor, but a web of interconnected ownership, where default anywhere threatens collapse everywhere. Add Morgan's mechanism from 1913. Central banks create money to buy government bonds, which means unlimited demand, and government can always borrow more. Add Volcker's trap from 1982. When countries can't pay, restructure instead of forgiving, keep the interest flowing, and extract concessions. The result is what we have today. $315 trillion in global debt broken down as government debt, corporate debt, and household debt. None of it will ever be repaid in the aggregate. All of it pays interest to someone, and all of it is connected through the financial system, so default anywhere threatens collapse everywhere. The four architects didn't conspire together because they lived in different centuries. William Patterson died in 1719, Nathan Rothschild in 1836, J.P. Morgan in 1913, and Paul Volcker in 2019. But each one solved a problem in a way that benefited bankers and creditors, and each solution built on the previous one. Patterson made debt permanent in 1694, so banks could collect interest forever instead of risking default. Rothschild made it global in 1815, so default would threaten the entire interconnected system. Morgan made it infinite in 1913 by creating a lender who can print money to buy bonds. Volcker made it inescapable in 1982 by preventing defaults through IMF restructuring that keeps interest flowing regardless of ability to pay. Together, they built a system where governments borrow forever and pay interest eternally, where the debt creates the money supply, so paying it off would destroy the economy, and where everyone owes money to everyone else in an interconnected web that can never be untangled. The people who control the bonds, who manage the debt, who collect the interest, they're the ultimate beneficiaries. Not governments who are trapped paying interest, not taxpayers who fund it through their labor, but the financial institutions who hold the bonds and collect the payments year after year after year. 38 trillion isn't a crisis for the institutions that hold government bonds. It's a business model that generates reliable income. Every dollar of debt is an asset on someone's balance sheet. It pays interest reliably. It provides collateral for additional borrowing. And as long as confidence holds, as long as people believe the government will keep paying interest, even if it never repays the principal, the system functions smoothly. The debt trap is complete, and escape isn't possible without collapsing the entire financial system. 4 architects across 3 centuries built this machine, one system operating exactly as designed, and everyone on Earth is now caught inside it. Governments can't stop borrowing without collapsing the money supply. Taxpayers can't stop paying interest without government default. And the institutions that hold the debt collect their payments every year regardless of economic conditions. This is how the paradox works. The world owes money to itself because debt is money in the system, and the interest payments are the rent everyone pays to live inside the machine these 4 men built. If you want to protect yourself when these patterns repeat, subscribe to this channel. I'll show you what assets survived past collapses, what strategies worked when currencies failed, and what warning signals to watch for right now. New videos every week, giving you the knowledge to prepare while there's still time.